The afternoon sun bathed the neighborhood in golden light, casting long shadows across the pristine sidewalks. Towering mansions lined the streets, each estate a testament to wealth and privilege. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and the occasional hum of a luxury car rolling down the road was the only disruption in this seemingly perfect world. A 12-year-old black boy walked past one of the grand estates, his backpack slung over his shoulders. His clothes were clean but slightly worn, his sneakers scuffed from years of use. He had taken this route home from school many times before, passing by houses that looked more like castles, each one larger and more extravagant than the last. He didn't envy the people who lived here. He had more important things to worry about. Life at home was not easy, but he never complained. His mother worked long hours, and he did what he could to help, whether it was watching his younger siblings, running small errands, or studying hard in hopes of building a better future. He was used to being the responsible one. It was second nature to him. As he walked, something unusual caught his attention. His eyes flickered to one of the grand mansions, where an open window on the second story stood ajar. A tiny figure moved near the edge, small hands gripping the window frame, chubby legs wobbling with each uncertain step. A baby. His breath caught in his throat. The child, barely old enough to walk, was crawling dangerously close to the edge of the open window, oblivious to the deadly drop below. The boy stopped in his tracks. His heart pounded as he scanned the house, searching for an adult. Through the enormous glass doors on the lower level, he caught a glimpse of the baby's parents inside. A man in a sharp business suit, his back turned, stood near a woman who looked equally preoccupied. Their conversation was animated, hands gesturing, their attention locked on each other, rather than the child above them. They didn't see it. They didn't see how close their baby was to falling. The boy swallowed hard. A part of him hesitated. Was it really his place to interfere? He was just some kid walking home from school. Would they even listen to him? Would they think he was trespassing? But the baby took another small movement forward, tiny fingers slipping from the window ledge. There was no more time to think. The boy dropped his backpack to the ground and sprinted toward the gate of the estate. His heart slammed against his ribs as he shouted, at the top of his lungs, his voice carrying through the perfectly manicured hedges. "Hey, someone help! The baby! Look at the window!" Inside the mansion, the parents remained unaware. The boy's pulse quickened. If they didn't hear him, if they didn't turn around in time, he had to do something, and he had to do it now. The boy had lived in the neighborhood for as long as he could remember, not in the towering mansions with their marble driveways and endless rows of hedges, but on the outskirts, where the houses were smaller, the streets were noisier, and life was far less forgiving. His world had never been filled with luxury, but that had never mattered to him. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, and he did what he could, helping his younger siblings with schoolwork, running errands, and making sure there was always something warm on the table when his mother came home exhausted at night. He never resented the hard work. If anything, it made him stronger. It made him value things that money could not buy: family, dignity, resilience. He had dreams, big ones, the kind that people around him often said were impossible. But he believed in them anyway. He worked hard in school, knowing that education was his ticket to a different future, one where he did not have to struggle, one where his mother did not have to break her back working double shifts, one where he could prove that success was not defined by privilege, but by determination. But it was not easy. The world had already decided who he was before he had a chance to show them otherwise. His classmates whispered behind his back, making jokes about where he lived. Shopkeepers in the nicer parts of town eyed him suspiciously when he walked through their doors, watching his every move. Even the people who smiled at him did so with a patronizing tilt of their heads, as if he were something to be pitied rather than respected. He had learned to live with it, to keep his head down and his focus sharp. He had learned that proving himself over and over again was just part of the deal. And he had accepted it, because he knew that if he let the weight of their prejudice crush him, he would never make it to the future he dreamed of. On the other side of the neighborhood, behind the towering iron gates of the mansion, lived a man who had never once had to prove himself to anyone. The billionaire was a man who had built his fortune from the ground up, a self-made mogul who prided himself on his achievements. He had worked his way into wealth, but along the way, he had developed a hardened belief that success was reserved for those who earned it, and in his mind, not everyone was capable of earning it. His money had given him more than just a lavish lifestyle. It had reinforced his sense of superiority. He saw himself as different, as better. He did not try to hide his disdain for people he considered beneath him, especially those who looked like the boy walking past his estate. To him, wealth was proof of worth, and anyone without it had simply failed to deserve better. He had built his empire, but he had also built walls around his home, around his world, and around his heart. He saw diversity as an inconvenience, equality as an illusion. In his mind, people like the boy would always be on the outside looking in. His wife, though less outwardly cruel, was complicit in her own way. She had never questioned the privilege she had been born into, never challenged the way the world bent to her comfort. She preferred to believe that racism was a relic of the past, a thing that no longer existed in the pristine world she lived in. She dismissed the struggles of those outside their social circle, convinced that hard work was the only thing separating success from failure. She did not hate people like the boy, but she also did not see them. She did not see the way doors were closed before they could be opened, the way opportunity was handed out unevenly. She had never known what it was like to walk into a room and be doubted before she spoke. To her, racism was a topic for history books, not something that shaped the world her husband dominated. But none of their beliefs mattered in the moment the boy saw their child at the window. None of their wealth, their prejudices, their ignorance. It all disappeared in the face of what was about to happen. Because in that split second, when the baby wobbled on the ledge, the only thing that mattered was whether or not someone was willing to act. And the boy, despite everything, despite the world that had never given him the benefit of the doubt, did what no one else had noticed needed to be done. He ran. The baby was moving too close to the edge. Her tiny hands gripped the windowsill as she crawled forward, unaware of the deadly drop below. She giggled softly, thinking it was just another part of her play, her small body wobbling with each movement. But one more inch, one wrong shift, and she would tumble down. The boy's breath caught in his throat. There was no time to think. His feet were already moving, pounding against the pavement as he sprinted toward the mansion. His backpack slipped off his shoulders, hitting the ground with a dull thud. His lungs burned from the sudden burst of speed, but he pushed himself harder, faster. "Hey! Someone help!" he shouted at the top of his lungs, but the wind carried his voice away. His eyes darted toward the large glass doors. Inside, the baby's parents were still deep in conversation, completely unaware of the danger happening right above them. His heart pounded as he reached the gate, finding it locked. There was no time to ring the bell, no time to wait. He scaled the metal fence without hesitation, landing in the yard with a soft thud. His sneakers barely touched the grass before he was moving again, his eyes locked on the window above. He spotted a trellis running along the side of the mansion, sturdy enough to hold his weight. Climbing was something he had done 100 times before. Scrambling up fences, scaling walls to retrieve a ball, or sneaking onto rooftops to watch the stars. But never had it been for something like this. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you had to act quickly? Have you ever faced an obstacle because of who you are or where you come from? Where are you watching from, and what time is it in your area? Hand over hand, he pulled himself up. The rough vines scraped his fingers, but he didn't let go. His legs burned from the climb, but he ignored the pain. He reached the second story just as the baby wobbled forward, her chubby fingers slipping from the ledge. With one final push, he lunged forward, gripping the edge of the windowsill and throwing himself inside. His arms wrapped around the baby just as her weight shifted too far. He pulled her back, his body landing hard against the plush carpet. The baby let out a startled cry, confused but unharmed. His chest heaved as he looked down at her, his hands still gripping her tiny body. He had made it. She was safe. A loud gasp filled the room. The billionaire father stood in the doorway, his face twisting in shock. His sharp blue eyes locked onto the boy, his jaw tightening as he took in the scene. The baby in the arms of a stranger, the open window, the boy's breathless form sprawled across the nursery floor. "What the hell is going on here?" the billionaire roared, stepping forward. His presence filled the room like a storm, and for a brief moment, the boy felt the weight of something even heavier than fear, judgment. The billionaire's gaze narrowed, his mind already forming conclusions. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" His voice dripped with suspicion, his fists clenched. "What are you doing with my child?" The boy opened his mouth to explain, but before he could speak, the billionaire's wife appeared. Her eyes darted between the boy, the crying baby, and the open window. And then, in an instant, she understood. "Oh, my God," she whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. She rushed forward, her hands trembling as she took the baby from the boy's arms. She turned toward her husband, her voice urgent. "He saved her." The billionaire's brows furrowed. "What?" She was about to fall, she continued, turning to the boy with wide, grateful eyes. "I saw it. He climbed up and pulled her back. He saved our daughter." The billionaire hesitated, his shoulders still tense. His deep-seated beliefs, his arrogance, made it hard to accept that this boy, this outsider, had done something so heroic. His instincts told him to keep control, to assert his power. But for the first time in a long time, he was speechless. The boy stood up, brushing dust from his clothes. He wasn't looking for praise. He had done what was right, just like he always did. He had saved a life. That was all that mattered. The boy stood still, his breath heavy, his body tense. The weight of the moment hadn't fully settled in yet. The baby, now cradled in her mother's arms, had stopped crying. Her tiny fingers gripped onto the woman's sleeve, unaware of the chaos that had just unfolded around her. The billionaire had yet to say a word. He simply stood there, staring at the boy as if seeing him for the first time. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of disbelief and something else, something deeper, something unfamiliar to a man who had spent his entire life believing in the division of power, wealth, and worth. The boy wasn't sure what to expect. He had seen enough in his life to know that good deeds didn't always earn kindness in return. Would the billionaire dismiss him? Accuse him of trespassing? Would he call the police? The thought tightened in the boy's chest, but he held his ground. Then something unexpected happened. The billionaire stepped forward, his piercing gaze locked on the boy. There was no longer anger in his expression, no suspicion, only an undeniable truth that he could not ignore. This boy, this stranger from a different world, had just saved his daughter's life. The billionaire exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You—" His voice caught, and for a man who had always spoken with absolute certainty, it was jarring to hear hesitation. "You saved my daughter." The boy nodded once. She was about to fall. "I did what I had to do." Silence stretched between them. The billionaire glanced at his wife, who looked at him expectantly, waiting for him to say what needed to be said. Then he turned back to the boy, something shifting behind his eyes. "You're different," the billionaire said finally, his voice quieter now. "I don't think I've ever met someone like you." The boy stiffened slightly, unsure of what that meant. Someone who doesn't hesitate. Someone who doesn't care about who's watching or what it might cost them. The billionaire's gaze dropped for a moment, as if he were thinking deeply about something, perhaps about himself, about the life he had built and the walls he had placed around it. Then came the part the boy didn't expect. "I want you to come back tomorrow," the billionaire said, straightening his posture. "I have an offer for you." The boy blinked. "An offer?" The billionaire nodded. "You saved my daughter's life. That's not something I can ignore. And I don't want to just thank you. I want to do something more. I want to give you an opportunity that no one else has had." He took a deep breath. "I want you to take part in my company. I want to give you control over something real, something that can make a difference in this community, a chance to change things." The boy stared at him, stunned. The world around him seemed to fade for a moment, the weight of the words hanging in the air. He had expected anything but this. "Come back tomorrow," the billionaire repeated, his voice steady. "Let's talk about your future." The boy sat across from the billionaire in a boardroom larger than his entire apartment. The polished glass table, the towering windows overlooking the city skyline, everything about the place screamed power. And now, somehow, he had a seat at the table. He still couldn't believe it. Just yesterday, he had been walking home from school, worrying about nothing more than his next meal and his grades. Today, he was being handed an opportunity that could change everything, not just for him, but for people like him, for the community he had come from. The billionaire leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "You don't have to accept this," he said, "but if you do, I want you to understand what this means. This isn't charity. You earned this. You acted with courage when no one else did. And I want to see what you can do with real power." The boy exhaled slowly. He wasn't just being given a seat. He was being given the ability to change things, to open doors for people who had never been given a chance. He thought about his mother, his siblings, the people in his neighborhood struggling to get by. He had spent his life watching others succeed while people like him were left behind. Not anymore. "I accept," he said finally. His voice was steady, filled with determination. The billionaire nodded. Something had shifted within him, too. For years, He had lived in a world that reinforced his beliefs, that power and wealth belonged to those who had fought for it, that success was reserved for the few. But this boy had shattered those ideas. He had proven that worth was not measured by money, but by actions. The boy wasted no time. His first act in his new position was to create initiatives aimed at giving opportunities to those who had been overlooked for far too long. He pushed for scholarships, community programs, and training for underprivileged youth to break into industries that had been closed off to them. He demanded that diversity and equity become part of the company's foundation, not just as a marketing strategy, but as a real commitment to change. And the billionaire, once so resistant to the idea of sharing his power, found himself transformed. He saw, for the first time, the impact his influence could have when used for something beyond personal gain. He began listening more, learning from the boy he had once dismissed. His wealth became a tool, not for dominance, but for justice. The company, once built to serve only the elite, started making real change. It became a beacon for inclusivity, proving that true success was not measured in profits alone, but in the lives it touched. And at the center of it all was the boy who had once been an outsider, now standing at the helm of an empire. The city stretched before him, a sea of glittering lights and towering skyscrapers. From his high-rise office, the view was breathtaking, a symbol of power and success. But the boy, no, the young man now, knew that this view meant nothing if the people below were still struggling. He had come a long way, from a small apartment in a neighborhood that the world often ignored to the very heart of an empire that had once seemed untouchable. He had walked the halls of power, sat at the tables where decisions were made, and ensured that those decisions no longer excluded people like him. The billionaire's company was no longer just another machine designed to serve the elite. Under the boy's leadership, it had transformed into something greater. The culture had shifted. Doors that were once closed to people from his background were now open. Hiring practices changed, mentorship programs flourished, and communities that had long been overlooked suddenly had resources and opportunities they had never dreamed of. People talked about the company's success, about its explosive growth, and the way it had reshaped the industry. But the boy didn't care about numbers on a spreadsheet. His greatest achievement wasn't the wealth, the power, or the recognition. It was the fact that he had turned this empire into a force for good. As he stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, hands in his pockets, he let his mind drift back to the moment that had changed everything. The baby crawling toward the open window, the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears as he ran, the billionaire's piercing glare before realizing the truth. That moment had not just saved a life, it had rewritten his own destiny. He had never saved the baby for a reward. He had not risked himself for power or recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. Because when you see someone in danger, you do not hesitate. You act. And sometimes all it takes is one act of courage to change everything.